Good afternoon. This is the fourth of the series of Dr. Obertashaka shows. Today, we're privileged to have a guest, Dr. Serie McDougal. And the topic for today is Black Men Studies, which is the title of his book. Here, Black Men Studies. And Black Men Studies, the 2020 election and beyond. So this is a discussion on the topic of Black men, and also in the context of this election. But the topic of Black men is much bigger than this election, which is a historical turning point, I think, but this is bigger, Black men. So our guest is Dr. Serie McDougal, and this is a brother I have a lot of respect for. In 2005, Dr. Wade Nobles and I decided to retire, and we each, along with our hiring committees, reviewed different candidates for our replacement. And I went through a lot of the files and stuff, and then I saw one file of Dr. Serie McDougal, and in the old school, there's a view sisters have, especially old school, and it would be wise if sisters today have the same view. And what you look for is potential. And he had just come out of a PhD program at Temple University in African American Studies. And what I saw was certain potential. And the potential was, I saw discipline in his file, that this was somebody who was serious. And I could read from the file that he had pretty good family background. To me, that's real important. And what I saw was potential. I saw, well, this is a guy who's going to advance the discipline. And once we interviewed him, you could see that he had other qualities, humility and intelligence, among others. So we hired him in 2005, and he became tenured professor, San Francisco State Black Studies Department, which is the mothership of four-year Black Studies departments in the country, now called Africana Studies. It gave birth to Black Studies at four-year institutions through a strike in 1968, a long strike. So since then, Dr. McDougal had become tenured, and at a very young age, a full professor. And his background is in education is that he received his BS in sociology from Loras College in Iowa, his MA in Africana Studies from State University of New York in Albany, and a PhD in African American Studies from Temple University in Philadelphia. And that is the PhD program that established PhD in Africana Studies led by Malefi Asante, outstanding scholar. So since then, Dr. McDougal went on to get tenured and then became a full professor at a young age. How old were you when you became full professor, sir?
See. That was 38, 37, 38, 37 or 38.
37. And he published this book, Research Methods in Africana Studies, which has received awards for its excellence. And his first passion is research. He's a serious researcher, which is a key indication of where a scholar is going to go. If they don't do solid research, then it's going to be not very much serious scholarship. So, so he became full professor and for a while chair of Black Studies, Africana Studies at San Francisco State, and then later led a student center. What was the name of the center at State?
Black Unity Center.
Black Unity Center. And now he's at Cal State, Los Angeles, where he is also a tenured professor. So his latest book is going to be the topic for today, at least the introduction for today, Black Men's Studies, Black Manhood and Masculinity in the U.S. context. And so I think it's fitting that he's the author of this book because I think in many ways he epitomizes real good, solid Black manhood. And the thing I like most about C.O.R.E is he has good human qualities, good man. His students love him, and he stands on principle. And so I think this is important. Before we get into this discussion today, this is a program that encourages people to read. As I say, if you're going to lead, you need to read, and you don't need to be a leader if you want to lead a meaningful life. And so some of the things you might want to look at as background for this discussion are the works of a great scholar named Zora Neale Hurston. And it's a picture of Zora Neale. And she is one of the pioneers in African-American culture. And some of what we're going to touch on today deals with both African and African-American culture. This is her most important work, Mules and Men, which she said was her most important work. I thought it was, but the author is always the expert on that, on their important works. So this was her look at Black culture at that time in the South. And one of her most insightful is Sanctified Church by Zora Neale Hurston. This is just a series of insights, powerful, really powerful. She had some of the best insights on African-American culture of any scholar. And then in terms of the formation of African-American culture in this country is a book called Exchanging Country Marks. There you go. Yeah, Exchanging Country Marks by a guy named Michael Gomez. And this is a book dealing with the formation of African-American culture. And then I would suggest Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, my book that also deals with African-American culture. So this is background. I know some people say they don't want to read. The last show we had on ADOS, Dr. Raymond Wimbush recommended that people should at least read 15 minutes a day. I had to laugh, 15 minutes a day. But I know for some people that's a lot. So start with that. You read a comic book longer than that. So this is the background for this discussion. So Dr. McDougal, I'd like to start this since we're dealing with Black males. First of all, if you could tell us something about yourself, who were your parents? Where were you raised? What was life like growing up as a young Black man?
Thank you. Well, I mean, first, thank you for the invitation to be on your show. And I also want to thank your viewers for the opportunity to speak to them as well. And to answer your question, I'm from Chicago, Illinois, the south side of Chicago, Illinois, and grew up in Brownsville, an area that's known as the Low End. And my experience growing up, my parents are Ann McDougal and Serie McDougal Jr. I'm the third. And I had a very happy upbringing, a lot of support, a lot of love, and they're the reasons why I'm anything that I have a success today, that's successful today, is because I definitely had a family that loved me and support me to today. So my mother is very strong. She is the fighter. My father is actually the more peaceful one, and he taught me uh, to have good judgment. So, and my mom taught me a lot of strength, and they just supported me. They never really stopped me from trying to do anything I wanted to do. Like if I wanted to, I mean, well, of course, I have discipline, but like I'm talking about in the professional world, or my ideas about what I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. They were very supportive. When I said I wanted to go to Africa for the first time, there was no reservation. They were there. They've always been very supportive of me. Growing up, again, household filled with support, a lot of reading. My father actually, that was one of his things that he always wanted to do. With my father, they were both workers. They worked constantly. You needed to be doing some kind of work. So with my father, he would walk. I could hear his footsteps going up and down this way or that way, down the hallway. And my room, the door would be open, of course. And whenever he walked past, I knew that he would shoot an eye into the room, and see what I was doing. So I would always want to at least appear like I was doing something or reading something or something, because then he'd ask me what I was doing and give me something to do. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of like I grew up in a household that had a strong work ethic. Like you have to be working, you have to be doing something. So that was my dad. And something Richard Pryor said that actually that was my model, my role model. So Richard Pryor said something one time. He was talking about his father, and he was like, "Oh, I thought my father was a superhero because it would be the wintertime and he would go out and lift up the hood of the car and make the car work in the freezing cold." That was my father. That was how I looked at him. And he was a model for me, but also my grandfather, who was very similar. He was my grandfather on my mother's side. Name was Will Ellis. And he was also, anybody from my family who ever listens to this knows that he was also someone who worked. He always worked. He couldn't, and he was known as someone who helped people in the community a lot. People would call him for help a lot. He would fix things for people. He would just help people. People got in trouble, he would help them, but he couldn't drive down 111th or Morgan in Chicago in Morgan Park without people recognizing his car and waving. So he might as well have kept an arm outside of the car window with it up, because so many people would be waving. But he worked all the way up until he couldn't work anymore. So that was another model that I had. So I was surrounded by those kinds of men. Yeah. And many more.
What's interesting in your description here is the role that your mother and father played, and the fact that what you described as your mother's role would in Western culture be described more as the male role, more of the fighter. But what's interesting in African and African American families is the interchangeability of roles between males and females. It's clear what a man is, what a woman is, but when it comes to essential character, the loving and supporting one can sometimes be the father, sometimes be the mother, sometimes be both. Um, and so, that interplay, I think, is a key quality of African family traditions carried into the African American setting. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case for me. And my mother is she is definitely the of the Sojourner Truth model. So she is very tough. There was one time where I lived in a neighborhood that, I mean, Chicago. We're talking about Chicago, so there were gangs in all neighborhoods. But I guess I finally reached the age where I would have to start confronting like situations with gangs. So she had I was on my we had our apartment building was next to there was a Popeyes on the Popeyes on the corner. And so there's the Popeyes chicken, and then there was the parking lot for the Popeyes chicken, and then our apartment was next to it. So the drive-through was there at the back, so I could actually hear people placing orders on the Popeyes in the Popeyes parking lot. But that's another story. But I was in the parking lot and I was on my skateboard, and I was playing, and I had not yet mastered my what I call hood vision. So, and that's my ability to see trouble coming from different, out of the corner of my eye. It was still being developed, but I was in the parking lot and I was on my skateboard. I was doing some tricks and practicing, and there was some guys that were coming from Robert Taylor, a very tall housing project near the highway expressway, Dan Ryan Expressway in Chicago in the 90s. But they were BDs, and I was in a Gangster Disciple neighborhood, a GD neighborhood. So these were Black disciples, and they would come down, and occasionally there would be some conflict between them and GDs in my neighborhood. But me, I was not involved in any gang, but they didn't know that yet. So they had formed a circle around me. I froze, so I didn't run or anything like that. I just froze. And I thought that it was over. I thought they were going to beat me up. And I thought it was going to be really bad. But my mom came down. So she came down, and she came down on the front steps. And I thought, okay, I'm saved. Not even thinking like, oh, these are like 8 or 9 young boys. They're not, how can my mom, I just thought she was invincible. So I hadn't even had a concept that that anyone could do anything to her anyway. So she came down and I thought I was saved. And so when she got down to where we were, she told me later that she had she had brought something with her. But I didn't know that. But she said, if you all want to skateboard, then fight them for it one-on-one, head up. And I thought, she must be crazy. Like, she wants me to fight them one-on-one, and if they win, they can have my skateboard. Oh my God. But so that in that instance, I didn't have to fight. They I don't know if they thought, man, this boy's mom is crazy. I don't know what's going on, but I didn't have to fight that day. But yeah, that's kind of like a snapshot of my mom. She was teaching me. She knew she didn't have a rough fighter on her hands, but I think she was trying to make sure that I had a minimum level of self-defense.
Yeah, but that was also a smart strategy. You know what I mean? Yeah,
Yeah,
she was playing Brad Rabbit there. You know, she was throwing out a strategy. She didn't know how it would go, but that got you out of a difficult situation. But as you say, she had carried backup with her. You know what I mean?
right. She always had backup.
And that was smart too, not to show it. You know,
Yeah,
because they did too. You know, more of it. But she was going to use it if her son really got into trouble. So right on. Yeah. So
yeah.
this little piece here is telling you a lot because your family, your mother, father, grandfather, and the love you got. I can say that that's obvious because that is exuded in your own character and your own personality. But I think we all come in with those qualities, certain qualities. Some come troubled, some come peaceful, whatever, but they're reinforced by our family. So it's pretty clear in your own makeup.
Oh, thank
Uh,
you very much.
Today, we're going to be discussing Black males, specifically drawing from your book titled Black Men Studies, Black Manhood and Masculinity in the U.S. Context. In the research and studies of Black men, do you think that the relationship between Black males and their fathers, especially during the period when you were growing up, where there were a lot of um, fathers absent in the home, which wasn't true in your case, do you think that the relationship between Black males and their fathers is given sufficient attention currently in studies of Black men? If so, why? If not, why not?
Well, I would say emphatically no, that Black males' fatherhood is very limited in how it's represented. It's very single dimension in how it's represented in scholarship. And why I think that the reason is because a lot of the research is stereotype driven research. It's problem driven research. So the descriptions of Black fatherhood are dictated by the problems and stereotypes about Black father absence, uh, and very little description of Black fatherhood, and definitely very little description of Black fatherhood from the voices of Black fathers. A lot of it is very anecdotal and focused on depravity. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, that's important because what you're saying. It reminds me of a lot of situations and experiences in Black life and my own studies, but my own experience as well, of the role that Black men, and you've described the role that your mother's played in your life, Black men have played, and very multifaceted, multidimensional. But what I found most interesting with Black men, including my own father, but many Black men that I know who are fathers and who play various roles in the lives of Black people and other Black men, is a strength of manhood of many of them. And the portrayal, uh, the Hollywood portrayal of the irresponsible Black man and the weak Black man and the fearful Black man, the buck-eyed Black man, that don't fit what I've seen in reality. In fact, manhood really manifested. I've seen it at a very high level with Black men. And, rarely have I seen the step and fetch it, which was my generation, stereotype of Black men. Rarely. And the ones that I've seen that seem to fit the role of weak, very often they're cunning and they're the little guys who are acting like, oh, nothing's going on. And those are the ones that you should really respect. So, yeah, I think your explanation of that, the need to stereotype is very important. At the same time, you're coming up during a generation in which drugs have started to hit the Black community. Um, and there are specific conditions going on that affect Black life. And so you come out of a stable family situation, but a lot of Blacks are coming out of a situation much tougher. So what do you see not only coming up during that time, but looking at it now as differences between what Blacks were facing then, young people like you, and then younger ones after you, and what you see going on and say in my generation, the so-called civil rights or Black power generation? What do you see as differences and similarities?
Wow, that's an interesting question because my knowledge of your generation is the knowledge I have of people people like you who were there, and also what I've read and of course studied. And my generation, and I think that my generation had uh, elements of that generation too, the racial pride, um, and also it was a generation where there was the gangs and drugs was I think had a significant impact, especially on Chicago's South Side in the 90s. However, the differences, I think, certainly that was one of the differences. Um, but then at the same time, the mainstream kind of uh, wave of Black power, Black cultural celebration, to have the movement for Black power reaffirmed in the arts and in music with Curtis Mayfield and um, James Brown, and that spirit. I think in the 90s you would have to, like today, you would have to create that sort of you'd have to be very intentional about creating an environment where you had people who think that way and surround yourself with that very intentionally. um, when I was growing up, in order to have that kind of environment. It wasn't, that wave wasn't as strong, I don't think. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. I'm not sure have a good answer.
Yeah, I think it's an honest answer that the racial pride continues in your generation and a lot of other things, but also your generation is heavily hit by drugs, by attack on Black leaders, many of whom have been assassinated. You had Fred Hampton, um, who had been assassinated by the FBI before probably your birth. A really strong Panther and really strong leader, and someone who was actually carrying out a apparently possibly successful effort to unify gangs and the Black Panther Party. And so brutal attack on his life. And that mirrored a lot of other things that happened. So, I think your description is accurate, that there's a continuation of certain features of the culture of the older generation, and then changes, and those changes continue to have an influence on subsequent generations of Black youth, particularly the hip hop generation. You've written a book on Black men that we've just shown, Black Men Studies, Black Manhood, Masculinity in the U.S. Context. So why'd you write this book? Why did you consider it necessary to put out a work of this type?
I think that the reason is definitely it's tied to what we talked about so far. I described my dad to you, my grandfather to you, even the neighborhood that I grew up in. I talked a little bit about gangs and everything, but I wanted to talk about men who I think were invisible, that were not seen. For example, the fathers. There's fathers who are strong fathers to their children, and they don't get, no one asks questions of them. They're not interviewed about what they think fatherhood is. They're invisible virtually, and or people who are. I talked a little bit about gangs in my neighborhood, and of course, I mean, like most people, I had my skirmishes and run-ins with gangs, but for the most part, the gangs in my neighborhood actually, after a while, they looked after me and other people like me who were not involved in gangs. And again, that's a side to them that you don't see much of. And I think that invisible Black manhood is a big part of why I wanted to write this book. I didn't see a lot of the men in my life reflected in research or scholarship on Black men, and very one-sided, very problematized, focus on hypermasculinity, hypersexual, Black men who are either ineffectual, weak, or aggressive, criminal, and threatening, but nowhere in between. Very one-dimensional. So it's dedicated to Black men who, in the eyes of the mainstream, don't really exist. So it was to give visibility to them, to give context to understanding Black men, historical context, cultural context, and to give a multi-dimensional, broad lens, broad scope of the different dimensions of Black manhood and masculinity, and also something solution-oriented and based on empirical research as well as theoretical work.
Yeah, what I'm just listening to you, invisible Black manhood. I think that's a good description. As you know, Ellison wrote a book called Invisible Man. And I think he didn't just mean man, he was referring to the invisibility of Black people.
Yes.
Your point about invisibility of Black manhood is very important. I mean, if you look at Hollywood, Danny Glover has been trying to get money together for a film on Toussaint, the Haitian Revolution, and hasn't been able to yet, because again, that's visible manhood. One of the key leaders of a revolution, the only one in the history of the world that destroyed slavery. And of course, as bad as Toussaint was, Dessalines was even better. In our last show on ADOS, we talked about Desaline. So this is a society that makes Black manhood invisible, but Black manhood is all around us. I remember there was a show that used to come on TV called Hawk. And in fact, recently I got to see a few replays of it. And I think Avery Brooks was the star, and he's a master actor. But this was the epitome of the kind of manhood I've seen all my life, hanging a gangster out of a window and telling him, "My name is Hawk. I own the night." A lot of Black men like that. So, I think that this concept of invisible Black manhood is an important concept. I just wanted to ask you another question, just as an overall thing. What are some of the characteristics that you, and we'll go into this in more detail at another time, that you see as essential qualities of Black masculinity and Black manhood? What are some of the qualities? Because I know that has to be gone into in depth, and I know that there's a lot of other things you have to cover, but just generally, what are some of the things that you've seen as key qualities of Black masculinity and Black manhood?
I would say that, and I would like to speak to kind of what I've seen uh, as far as how Black men have answered that question, because there has been a few studies that actually talk to Black men, very limited though, that ask Black men to talk about what Black manhood means to them, and the common ones that, or the reoccurring ones that Black men speak to, are ones that I agree with myself, and it tend to be knowledge of self-awareness. A lot of Black men associate manhood with um, knowing themselves, their skills, their capabilities, and who they are culturally. But also, Black men tend to associate manhood with responsibility and accountability. So, I mean, responsibility to themselves, but also to their families and communities. Black men, and this is known. I mean, this is often associated with manhood, but providing. So, but that providing, as Black men define it, is not just resources, but also social and emotional, as well as things like financial, which financial is more associated with providing. But when you ask Black men what they mean when they say providing, they include things like emotional support and social support of their family members and their children. It's just that a lot of times when Black men talk about what manhood means to them, they use language, more masculine language, like they'll say providing, and people go, "Oh, not emotional." And they're Black, men associate things with providing. But if you ask them what that means, then they tend to associate providing with more, also nurturing, um, in ways that include warmth and gentleness, compassion, connecting with others, but also morality, having principles that you stand up for. Black men often associate manhood with having principles and morality that you're willing to stand up for. Having an achievement orientation, goal orientation. Black men often associate manhood with having a focus, a determination toward achieving goals. Assertiveness and self-determination, and spirituality, which is one thing that when people write about Black males and masculinity, manhood, they often don't mention that when Black men talk about what manhood means, one thing that separates them from men, for example, white males, is that they often associate manhood with spirituality too. So I would say those things. And that's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, uh, and 8, about 8 principles. But to me, that's what manhood means. I associate it with those values, and those are invisible. Those are things you don't see. They're not. They're invisible. I associate them with uh, what in in Africana studies is often associated with the deep structure of culture. Those invisible things, beliefs and values. That's what I associate manhood with.
And I would say, knowing you, I think that you embody these principles quite well. Knowing you. In fact,
Thank you.
yeah, your marriage, your wife, Zuma, is that correct?
Zama.
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 Zama's testimony to your character was true, very true. And one of the things that I found that Black women usually say when they talk about the qualities they value most in Black men, one is, and in good relationships, always, and in relationships that are both difficult and not so difficult, because I've seen some relationships that are very hard because the people have very different backgrounds. And I'll ask the women and say, well, what holds this relationship together? There's a lot of things, but the thing that they'll stress most often is kindness. They'll say, well, he's kind, you know what I mean? Which embodies a number of the qualities that you just referred to: emotional support, um, also usually a deep spirituality. Um, and what you've just described here are really key operational elements of African American culture, with spirituality being on the top. So, also, I have a friend, Kendi Solowazi, who's a person who has a deep understanding of African family relationships. He's been married close to 50 years, and a real deep understanding of Black women. And we both have an appreciation of African American culture. And he makes the point that in relationships, the thing that inspires Black women about Black men more than anything, in fact, he has a way of putting it. He says, a Black woman's sexual organ, biggest sexual organ, is the mind. And the Black man who exudes intelligence, and that includes many of the qualities you were just referring to: purpose, direction, many of those things are most important to them. And so it affirms the qualities that you talked about, which are beautiful qualities and multifaceted and multidimensional. You know, that's beautiful. Um, in your intro, oh, by the way, your audience, your book on Black men's studies, who are you aiming your audience at?
So wrote this book for people who have a genuine interest in learning more about Black males. Also for people who are involved in services that include Black males, service providing. So it and most importantly for Black males to use uh, to form groups and to discuss Black manhood and masculinity amongst themselves. And it I do often mention this, but it wasn't written to sensitize anybody to black men, or to convince or change people's minds about black men. You know, some people have negative views about black men. It was not written for them, you know, to change anybody's minds about black men, but it was just written for anyone who has a genuine interest in understanding black males better.
In other words, your book wasn't written as a reaction.
Right.
It's written with positive objectives in mind. Dr. McDougal has a very interesting introduction in his book. And he's referring to male initiation ceremonies in traditional African societies, the Dagara people in West Africa. And one of the interplays in his book is he's drawing between traditional African culture and values, particularly in what he calls pre-colonial Africa, before the colonization of Africa by the Europeans, and African-American culture. And so he gives an account in the initiation of men in Dagara culture, D-A-G-A-R-A, people from West Africa. And he's describing the initiation of Western educated Africans and the reaction of traditional Africans, their elders, who have not been educated in traditional Western education. Their reaction to Western educated Africans who are now being brought through a traditional system of education. And in the first stages, they describe Africans who have been Western educated as having damaged spirits, and that they say comes from teachings, Western teachings, that lead them to conspire against themselves. Damaged spirits taught to conspire against themselves. So, Dr. McDougal, could you describe some of the ways that Western education has worked to damage the spirit of Black people, especially Black males, leading some to conspire against themselves?
I think that education, along with the media, hand in hand, engage in misinformation and disinformation about Black males. They create a way, not just a way of perceiving Black males, but they shape these stereotypical perceptions and lack of information. It tries to become the world around Black males. I'll try to explain what I mean when I say that, but it shapes how Black men perceive themselves and their possibilities. And it damages the sight because of that. And for example, Muhammad Ali has this quote where he's talking about engaging in a fight, or like fighting, especially when he was fighting people who were bigger and stronger than he was. But he said sometimes one person can see farther than another, you know. And he talks about how if you don't have this vision where you can see farther, you can't see beyond this world of this misperception in your present environment, what's around you. You get caught up in how big your opponent is, and what their record is, and how hard they punch, and all of these kind of things, and lose sight of how far you can go, or not see how short-lived or how limited or inaccurate this immediate perception is. So to get past that analogy, or try to make a little more sense, I think that because Black males don't see examples of themselves, they don't see themselves reflected in a curriculum, and when they do see themselves reflected in the media or in what they're learning, they see these images of them as unintelligent, aggressive, criminal, um, and it can damage the sight. And I love that chapter in Maladoma Some's book of Water and the Spirit because it's such a great analogy. He can't pass this rite of passage until he learns to see, which means he has to unlearn what a lot of the limitations placed on him by the education that he received in Burkina Faso from the missionaries, went to missionary school. So he rejected a lot of African spirituality. So he had to develop a spiritual sight, but he was being prevented because everything he learned told him that what the elders were asking him to do was impossible. So he couldn't see. And I think that because of the educational experience, how Black males are treated, criminalized in education, the expectations that their educators and would-be educators have of them precludes them having a good educational experience in a lot of cases. And so it can damage the sight.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I went through 12 years of public school, 4 years of college, 2 years of law school, which damaged sight in the sense that um, I didn't have a Black teacher, let alone any relevant knowledge of self, except what I got from my family, which was quite good. From my father, who played the role that your mother played in your family, a fierce warrior, and my mother, who had pride. My father had Black pride. My mother had pride, just basic pride, and they come out of Black culture. But then I'm bombarded by everything white. And so, in that sense, my perception was on remote control, meaning I was thinking someone else's thoughts and didn't know it. Because even though my father was trying to teach me something else, his consciousness was way over my head. I mean, he had understood the history of how the West had exploited Africans and all this, and I hadn't had I had that experience but didn't understand it. So I understand what you're saying there, and your point about Muhammad Ali um, seeing that opponent. If you don't see beyond the size of an opponent or whatever their gifts are, you can exaggerate their power over yours. And that certainly is a situation for Blacks in a society in which real power, police power, military power, uh, the power of the state is in the hands of people that don't look like us, even if once you have one head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who's Black or one president. The institutions are basically white. So you can see how that happens. Um, and all I would say is that the battle for liberation is really, along with true knowledge of self, the path to seeing beyond that. But in here, you're referring to the fact that the initiate um, who's being taken through African education has to draw on powers that Western education um, don't teach, diminish, attack, and don't respect. So what do you see as some of the processes that people have to go through to bring out those inner powers? Because that's on a number of different levels.
Yes, I think. Well, first, I think that that's like a part of the importance of your own research on those systems of mastery um, in African American culture and African culture, which I look forward to reading So I wouldn't assume to have the answer to that, but I think that studying those cultural practices and processes, at least one of the things that they tell us is that one of the things that initiation process does is it takes you away from distractions. It involves some level of separation, testing, and then reintegrating into the community. And I think that we do that on some level in Africana studies, my discipline. We do that on some level, on a more micro level. Students come into Africana studies classes and learn about themselves and the environment in an Africana studies class. If it's done the way it should be, it takes students out of the campus environment. It has a completely different value set. It looks at things through the cultures, the experiences, the historical context of people of African descent first. It rejects white supremacist or anti-Black perceptions, challenges them, debunks them, and then students leave that classroom and they go back into that environment and they're changed. They're a little different. They engage the campus a little bit different. They start challenging things in the on campus and off campus. They become more assertive. They become more perceptive of anti-Blackness, and they have a greater orientation toward advancing the Black community. So I think that it happens in these small ways, and I used Africana studies as an example. But I think for Black males in particular, it's important that Black males have similar environments where they come out of their everyday environment, put themselves in one another's company, think about the world in a different way or through their own lenses about how to empower themselves and their communities, their families, and then go back and then re-engage. But without having those organizations or avenues to separate, flip the script, so to speak, engage the world from their own perspectives, and then reintegrate, then we can be overwhelmed because those false perceptions and misinformation, disinformation tries to make our world small. It tries to make our world what other people think about us, tries to make us accept them, and the world becomes small when that happens. But then when we realize I think what Marcus Garvey did is he showed us how big the world is and what our possibilities are. And I think that by engaging the world through our own lens, and Black men doing that in Black men's groups, which is something that I encourage, the world becomes bigger because our perceptions of ourselves and our possibilities becomes bigger.
Yeah, that's good. And what I'd say is that I think that in the case of Africana studies, or some people still call it Black studies, I think that the teachings that have the most important impact on students are taught by teachers who live what they're teaching. And that gives them a sense of a reality, because it's not simply something coming from a book. It's which the book is important, but it's coming from life. And when people can see that, then they see its application to themselves. So I think that that's a key quality. In terms of the meaning of sight, I would suggest that there are two levels here. One level, which you described, which is messed up for both Black males and females, which is the level of identity. And that's the false information about our history, our culture, that tries to write us out of our history and culture. And so being able to see in traditional Africa, that wasn't a problem. So if you're dealing with ancient Kemet or Egypt or Ghana or whatever the societies were, the Yoruba, Dogon, they didn't have to teach someone
Yeah.
to be a Yoruba, a Dogon. That was a course of the education, but they didn't have to deal with the miseducation. And that's literally what your book is addressing when you have traditionalists dealing with those Africans who have come under Western miseducation as we are now. So the issue of identity becomes extremely important. And in the modern terms, we'll say they're being re-Africanized. So that is a process. And in this show, we started off by stressing that central focus of this show would be on freeing the mind, and particularly centering people in terms of their own identity so that they have a solid sense of self-knowledge. One of the things that Dr. McDougal stressed as a key component of Black manhood, and I would say also Black womanhood, self-knowledge of personal skills, but self-knowledge of identity as African people and as African Americans. So that's one level. And we'll be going through a process called the Sixfold Stages to Mental Freedom, a process that Malcolm X went through, Amilcar Cabral went through, I've gone through, many others, and many haven't. And this is really the process for freeing your mind in the sense of identity. The other, and by the way, that can only happen if you apply it to your life. It's not just an intellectual exercise. You've got to live it. The other level, which I think in the initiation process that was being described in the introduction to Dr. McDougal's book, where the Dagara people, the elders are taking young miseducated Africans through, that site they're referring to as spirit site. And that's another level. And that's the opening of what in Kemet is called the Ka, which is your destiny, or the Yoruba call Ori, or the Igbo call Chi. That is the path that you picked in heaven that you came down here to fulfill. Those are the gifts that you have, and how do you master those gifts? And when you open that up, you're also opening up the spirit, because the Ka is a spirit, it's the life force of a person. And so that's the path of mastery. If you want to do that, that is the path where you're trying to be the best human being you can be, and particularly around your special gifts. And you're seeing behind me two frames, one of a brother with sunglasses, that's Amilcar Cabral, the greatest leader in the 20th century, and I think the greatest thinker. Well, political leader, military leader, and someone that underwent the transformations of consciousness. And that was really the key to his greatness. And then on the other side, you see El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, brother Malcolm X. That is a painting by the great artist Emory Douglas, former Minister of Culture of the Black Panther Party. At my 80th birthday, he honored me with that rendition. He's a master artist and a great human being. So that process that they're describing is the process of the light and opening the light. Western education has no clue about how to do that. And this initiation process here was a process described by Dr. McDougal in his introduction of getting the initiate back to his own spirit. So that's another process. And Dr. McDougal is referring to a book that I'm finishing on that, Seba, or the light that is within. Um, your book moves between African culture and African American culture. And in your definition of manhood, you are drawing from some deep African American culture that has fundamental African foundation. So what role does African and African American culture play in the process of opening the eyes of Black males so they can see?
African. Okay. Yeah. Before I answer that, I knew that this is why I wanted to. I was looking forward to having a conversation with you about this topic, whether it was on the phone or over Zoom, because I knew you were going to have something very interesting to add. So I appreciated what you said about the two levels. This is why it's so fun to talk to you about these kind of topics. So I appreciate it, that Dr. Shaka, as always. And as far as the role of Africa, I think that what it does is time. I think time is used against Black males in a lot of cases, because Black males are taken out of time. They're looked at for an act, an episode, a moment, and that allows narrative shaping. Because I think this is the age of narrative shaping. It's just narratives are shaped about Black men in the moment, and people fill in gaps in information with assumptions about Black males, whereas historical context is what gives Black males understanding. It gives the only thing you can do in the moment without historical context is describe. You can describe moments, describe people, but to understand Black males requires the historical context. And Africa does that. Starting with Africa, I try to start every single chapter in the book with Africa and how and Black males' understandings of different concepts in Africa first. Um, and that's because it gives the Black male experience continuity. And without Africa, Black male thought and behavior is explained as reactions to economic circumstances, reactions to racial injustice. But if we look at Africa first, then we can see Black male thoughts and behaviors as extensions of who we are, regardless of what has happened to us or what other people have done to us. And then we can see more clearly that which is actually a reaction to oppression. But we can't differentiate between the two without historical context. Just like understanding me, like you asked me the questions about my background, and I'm sure that a part of it is to better understand why I take the approach that I take today. And that's the best way to do it, by putting Black people, or Black men in this case, in historical context. And you can't do that without Africa. Without Africa, everything looks like a reaction to America. Everything looks like a reaction to oppression.
Oh, heavy, brother. You're getting real heavy there. Time is used against us. I think that's a really good point, that an episode can describe a person's life. You steal a cigarette or a piece of bologna and you're going to jail for 20 years, or you do something more serious, but that episode becomes like the definition of you, not the whole life. I think that's a profound point you're making there, you know. But your point about historical context, that is very important, that you really can't understand our beingness unless you understand its connection, its historical connection. I think that's really heavy. So in doing the link between African and African American culture, just a few linkages that you see between the link between African history and culture and African American culture and history and beingness. Just a few.
Yeah, I mean, I think that between African American, absolutely. I mean, I think that, for example, if you look at Black spirituality and religion, is probably one of the best examples that if you look at Black people and the way Black people worship, the way Black people express religion and spirituality, it will never make sense without looking at African spiritual systems first. Because if you look at Black people as um, arriving in the American colonies, you know, and they're exposed to this Puritan style of worship where you don't the religious leaders are the ones who write songs. You're supposed to hold still. It when you're praying or singing, um, and if you don't, then that's a sign of devil worship or something evil. And Black people in the American colonies, when they praised, they danced, they shouted, they created their own sounds. They are physically involved. They experienced spirit mounting, or being embodying a spirit, and those kind of things make absolutely no sense of how they emerged if you don't look at African spiritual systems, which were very much danced spiritual systems, where spirit mounting was common, where physical movement was a part of, not just a part of, but essential to spirituality. So when you look at African African people in the American colonies outside of African context, it makes no sense why they worship the way they did. However, when you look at African spiritual systems first, then the way Black people practiced Christianity, as an example, as different from whites, it makes perfect sense. And it actually looks like continuity and not um, just the experience of oppression and depravity.
That's an excellent example. In fact, because of your roots in Chicago, and by the way, most Blacks who come from Chicago treat it like it's a nation. You know, we have a good friend, Dr. Sharuda, Dr. Dorothy Sharuda, former chair of Black Studies. For her, Chicago is like a nation. And anytime she can escape and get renewed, it's Chicago, you know. And Chicago Blacks are heavily Mississippi Blacks. And Mississippi Blacks are heavily spiritual blues Blacks. And I would also say one of the strongest groups of Blacks in the United States who came out of the roughest, toughest circumstance of hell. My grandmother and great grandmother came out of that. So your description of that is a really good example, because many of us who call ourselves Afrocentric tend to regard the Black church as something that we picked up from white people, which is far from the truth. We're not going to go into that today. But what I'd say is that what Dr. McDougal has just described are the essential features of African spirituality practiced in what we call Black religion. And it's at the core of our culture. So that's a very good example. Dr. McDougal, in the context of the 2020 presidential election, which will take place this Tuesday, concerted effort has been made to shift what may be a small percentage of the young Black male vote by using hip hop figures like Ice Cube, 50 Cent, of all people, Lil Wayne, and others, to increase Trump's showing in the Black vote column by giving him 2 or 3 or whatever small percentage that he can add to that. He's doing the same thing with Latinos. So are there specific values that younger Black males have that may have come out of their experiences, 80s, post 80s experience, or others, that are the values that Trump and the Republican Party are appealing to? If so, can you describe some of these values and how representative of these values, expressed in this case by some younger Black males, is this of Black males at large? And it's interesting that they're aiming this at Black males, not Black females.
Yeah, it is. It is interesting. I think that there's a larger phenomena. I think that this is taken advantage of. I think it's taken advantage of the growing gap when it comes to income and wealth between the upper economic echelon of Black people and the bottom, and that widening gap is something that the Black collective conscious has overcome in terms of voting, that despite those class divisions that Black people have voted with this concept of that's known as linked fate. But with the growing gap, there's a growing gap between the two, between the upper class of Black elite or wealthy Blacks and those who are on the bottom of that distribution. And this is like kind of a political maneuver that's old in terms of divide and conquer or using a few Black people to misrepresent the others. But it's also something that's going to be used more often, I think, because there's going to be an expectation that the values of those who are of upper income are going to be different from the masses. So that's something that I think as a community, we will have to anticipate more of this going forward. But I think right now they're not representative, and I think that definitely it is very intentional divide and conquer, smoke and mirror effect. And so many of the ones who are saying these things are people who are entertainers, they're high profile individuals, and they're individuals who have some connection. Not all of them, of course, but some of them have personal connections, personal relationships with Donald Trump. And if you listen to the things they say you can't judge him by what he says. He's actually different when you get to know him or when you meet him personally. And it's not a real sophisticated political analysis. They want you to judge a Donald Trump that we don't know, and based on his character and his personal characteristics and not his policy. And then after that, they want us to forget the personal characteristics that we see with our own eyes and do it based on the Donald Trump that they know when they meet him one-on-one or whatever their personal relationship with him. It's that old saying, who are you going to believe? Ice Cube or your lying eyes? It's like, or Lil Wayne. Or I don't want to pick on Ice Cube. I think he was more neutral, but Or I guess some of the others then.
That's perceptive, and I think he was slick. I think that he's acting like he's offering something for both. When if you're a Jew in Germany and Hitler's carried out genocide, he hasn't completed it, and you have a choice. If you were one left to choose between Hitler and someone else, and you'd offer a program to both. Since Hitler's already iced most of your people, what have you got to offer? And in the case of Trump, since he's pretty well done his number, you know, I don't think most people know that Trump was offered a chance in the case of COVID-19 to come up with a test offered by his mercenary son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a bunch of billionaires, but doctors, and they actually came up with a test. Probably wasn't the best test, but it was a national test. And Trump said no. And the reason was he said, it's the blue states that are dying, meaning blacks and brown. We were doing the dying. And he said, we'll just blame this on the governors. And we now know he's known how serious this whole COVID thing was all along. Or we've seen him sick the right wing on blacks, or in one case where two nonviolent demonstrators were murdered by a 17-year-old right-wing militia member whose fat mother brought him to the demonstrations. She herself packed with weapons and pictures of her. Trump says, well, that's self-defense. I mean, nonviolent demonstrator. So as you say, we're going to believe what your eyes see, or right now calling out the militias to intimidate blacks to vote. And I think your point about the income difference is very important, because Shaq himself and others, they've also made that comment. That's a brother I like a lot, and I'm conscious. I like how he treats his mother. I know some things that I won't mention on this show that show his consciousness and the positive side. You know, some stuff he's done that's very conscious. But talking about likes the, not him, but others have said, and he may well believe this, that the tax program of Trump is better than the tax program of Biden. Well, what does that mean? The rich get off with paying fewer taxes. And so some of them are in the category of the rich. But when the police come down on your head, they're not looking at your bank account. They're just coming down on your head. So that point, I think, is an important point. There is a divide based on wealth, and some are drawing a distinction. Others are not, who are in the wealth rank, you know. LeBron James isn't, you know, a lot like him. And also conscious, very conscious, and doing a lot of good work for Black people. And as your point makes, this is a trend that we have to look at, but at the same time, you had a term, shared fate. Was it linked fate? Linked fate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that we're Black, so we share a linked fate. So yeah, good point. So part of the question is going to be whether this election is close, because if it's close, those games can play out and work against us. If not, then we have people who are on the side of the enemy, not our people, and they have to answer for it. So we're going to see, and we're going to have a follow-up discussion this coming Saturday at 10 on Black males pursuing this on a deeper level, and also looking at the outcome of this election. So in closing, Dr. McDougal, either in the event of a Biden victory or defeat, the issue is for Black men, what are some of the programmatic things that need to be put forward by Black men that will empower them in many different ways, but especially economically? And I want to say this, as someone who took part in the Million Man March, was a follow-up organizer for Minister Louis Farrakhan, and the National Black United Front that I was vice chair of played an important role in terms of mobilizing. The nation played the most important role, but played a supportive role. Dr. Conrad Worrell, who was passed on to the ancestors, played an important advisory role to Minister Farrakhan, which he acknowledged recently in a conversation that we had on Conrad's passing. So that was an attempt by Black men to make a unified statement, which came under considerable attack. The Million Women's March didn't come under the same attack. Now, I understand that some people had reasons associated with who was sponsoring the march, but I said that if Black men got together and peed in the same place at the same time, that would be positive. But if we're coming together to make a statement, that's real positive. So, what are your views on some of the things that Black men need to be putting forward as programmatic um, statements that can empower Black men economically, which is going to strengthen Black families?
I think let's see. I think Black men need to first and foremost. I think well, let me actually make a correction first. I don't want to be misunderstood, but I guess I shouldn't have said Ice Cube. I think what Ice Cube's quote was that Donald Trump is what I found it. What he said: Donald Trump is what Americans love. Donald Trump is what Americans aspire to be: rich, powerful. Do you want to do what you want to do? Say what you want to say. Be how you want to be. So I think he was kind of like saying that you can, whoever's going to be in power, find common ground with and try to develop a plan. So I think I should have said Shaq or someone like Lil Wayne or like Dennis Rodman, because these are folks who try to speak to praise Donald Trump more so. So I guess I should have said, who are you going to believe, Shaq or your lying eyes, you know? But because Ice Cube was far more neutral, but like open, I think, open to Trump more so. But as far as the question, like as far as programmatic things, I think that Black men need to create more Black men spaces. Need to come together and form mentorship programs more. I think one of the things that you asking me the questions that you did today, it makes me think of the kinds of experiences that I had that led me to do all of the things the good things in my life. I think that I can think of came from me having an encounter with other Black men who, in part, because it's also non-Black men, but encounters with Black men who I can remember my teacher in high school, guy by the name of Mark McConney, who took me out of a class. He put me into a honors class. I didn't think I belonged in anybody's honors class, but he wanted to put me in an honors class. But he saw something in me. He was a Black man who saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. And those experiences like that changed. Those are the most transformative experiences in my life. Going to San Francisco State, the people on the hiring committee, yourself, the things that you said today were very complimentary, and I appreciate what you said, everything you said. And I didn't see those things in myself. Definitely not at the time, and still, I mean, I'm trying. I know that they're compliments and they're very good things, and I want to live up to them. And I do see them more now than then. But it was experiences where there were other Black men who saw things in me that I didn't see in myself. And I think we need to create more spaces like that where Black men come into contact with other Black men, older Black men and same age, who can relate to their experiences, who can affirm their experiences, who see something in them, who can help them in all settings. Outside of the universities, on college campuses, there are these men's of color initiatives across the country. But we need, it's not, the men of color approach is not going to be what does it. It's going to need to be Black men organizations, Black men collectives to come together first and foremost. And that's just in the educational setting. If we want to talk about policies, that Black men should support, I'm not sure. We can do that. Like there's different policies I think that Black men should be behind, but there's so many of them. I think maybe we should save it for the next conversation, unless you want to talk about something specific, like maybe educational policies or economic ones, or things like that. We can do that. We can talk about those if you want me to. But as far as general,
yeah.
I think more Black men organizations and collectives first and foremost.
Yeah, I think that's the appropriate realm for right now. And spaces where we share ideas and help each other grow is extremely important. And I want to stress to the listening and viewing audience, we'll be covering Black families. We're going to be covering Black women. And we're going to have both Black men and women discussing this, because I think of all God's creations, woman's the most special one. Black woman is real special. So that's going to be a discussion that we're going to have ongoing as well. And this is just the beginning of this discussion on Black males. I think what you've heard from Dr. McDougal, Dr. Serie McDougal, is what we call deep thought. And I'm really proud of him and proud of brothers and sisters like him. And this is what my life's about, playing any role I can and sharing things and definitely learning, because I learned a lot from what Dr. McDougal had to say today. And I hope you did as well. So
Definitely.
next Saturday at 10, we'll be going deeper into Black manhood, Black masculinity, the issues that Black men face. A lot of you have Black boys that you're raising. You're in relationships, Black men and Black women. Um, some have had trials to overcome because prison industrial complexes hit a whole lot of Black men, and a growing number of Black women that shouldn't be in prison. And I agree with Angela Davis and Black Lives Matter. Prisons need to be eliminated. We had over 100,000 years of civilization with no prisons, no jails. And if anything, those who have created a criminal society that make people have to steal a loaf of bread or bologna and go to jail for 20 years, if we have to have a prison, lock them up. But to be consistent, just as I'm against capital punishment, I would like to see the elimination of prisons. But here we've been talking about the imprisonment of the mind and freeing it. So Siri, this has been a real joyful exchange. I learned a lot.
Same.
I really want to thank you. And I hope everybody that checks this out will get a lot from it. And I look forward to extending this discussion next Saturday. And I look forward to the people who are watching this to get out and vote. And I'm not going to say,
Oh, shit. Dr. Tashaka, I think your microphone is muted.
You're fine. Vote like you like.
yeah, vote. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, vote like your life depended upon it. And the second show, which was on lessons from post-Reconstruction's voting Trump out of the White House, into the jailhouse, it was really showing that we're at an 1876 moment. Hayes-Tilden Compromise, where Blacks were really put in a position where we were returned to slavery. And we have now a different historical circumstance where whites are facing becoming a minority by 2040, 2044. And this is a defensive action they're taking, stacking the Supreme Court, stacking district court judges, gerrymandering to keep whites in some kind of power, even though they're going to lose this numerical power. So it's very important that people vote. And I think that the grassroots are showing their brilliance by the number of people that have voted, standing in line for 12 hours when they should have been able to vote in 10 minutes. And they see through Trump's game. They've tried to scare people. People aren't scared. And this is a different period of history. So I encourage people to get out there and vote Trump out of the White House. Please believe me, there are plenty of people waiting to put him in the jailhouse. But more important, let's deal with the issues in our community. And one of the most important is the issue of Black manhood, Black womanhood, and the thriving and liberation of Black people. So I want to thank everybody, you especially, Serie. Thank you.
Thank you.